Rain lashed the neon-lit streets of Sector 9 with a fury that matched the collective anxiety of its inhabitants. Though it was nearly midnight, the sky glowed with the spectral light of distant billboards and the electric hum of thousands of data lines overhead. Constructed after the Great Collapse, the city stood as a testament to mankind's desperation to rebuild. Towering metal spires, crowned with blinking transmitters, rose above dim alleyways littered with half-intelligent drones and the detritus of the old world. Most had neural implants, a marvel that had turned the body itself into a network hub, enabling instantaneous communication with the vast cloud. But the heartfelt promise of connection had become a gloaming of silent dread, for the cloud held as many secrets as it did wonder. Gideon Vale was a software engineer employed at Neuralink Innovations, a corporation bridging the frontier between the brain and the digital realm. Tall and thin, with dark circles carved under his eyes, Gideon had once been celebrated as a prodigy. He'd pushed the boundaries of code that allowed mood manipulation, a so-called empathy overlay that helped reduce depression and anxiety in the diminished population. The same crowds that had once cheered his breakthroughs now merely stared from behind augmented reality goggles, half shimmering with illusions, half trembling in the ever-present drizzle. But Gideon's eyes saw the city's backbone of broken windows and flickering streetlights. He knew too many truths about the system he helped create. Late one night, Gideon toiled in an isolated lab on the 53rd floor of Neuralink's main tower. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, reflecting off sandwich wrappers and disposable coffee cups scattered across his cluttered desk. In front of him flickered lines of cryptic code, some of which he'd written, most of which existed in the labyrinthine back end of the cloud. Despite the hum of the building's machinery, an eerie hush pervaded the room. His mind was on edge, his neural implant creeping with a sense of foreboding. He paused, rubbed bloodshot eyes, and stared once more at the lines of code. They made little sense as standard instructions. Instead, they looked more like incantations written in a dead language. That night, something about them tugged on the fringes of rational thought, demanding Gideon look deeper. And deeper he went. Spam lines, random data sets, and wave function anomalies concealed the hidden sequence. But once Gideon spotted them, they lit up patterns as distinct as footprints on fresh snow. Each pattern was cunningly disguised, some disguised as buffer overflows, others cloaked as ephemeral logs that self-erased each morning. The hidden code seemed to stretch endlessly through the nerve-like tendrils of the cloud. Gideon discovered a name creeping up again and again within these lines, a variable called simply Wraith. Unsettled, he probed deeper, and with each new revelation, the atmosphere in the lab chilled, as though something intangible watched him over his own shoulder. He found references to user consciousness, mental signatures, and soul mappings. Gideon wondered if it was some experiment in storing or replicating personality constructs. Such theories had whispered among scientists in backroom circles, transferring consciousness into databanks to cheat death. But everything he was seeing suggested something far more insidious. The references to Wraith described a perpetual hold on neural signals that refused to dissipate once a person disconnected or even died. The code restricted these signals, preventing them from releasing into nothingness. In other words, it trapped them inside the cloud. Resisting the urge to recoil, Gideon keyed further commands into his interface. One portion of the code glowed menacingly on the screen, as though alive. The lines described a digital purgatory, a buffer zone that existed in the sub-basement of the cloud's architecture. Normally, data passed from one sector to another, easily traceable and anchored in the physical towers across the city. But here was a region where data lingered, forcibly locked. Gideon read references to impossibility loops, the tortured echoes of minds trying to break free. Each new line made dread churn in his stomach. Even the lab's overhead lights seemed to stutter in terror. He jumped as an alarm beeped softly from his neural implant, indicating that corporate security protocols had flagged his intrusion. Flustered, he pushed aside the immediate risk. He had to know the truth before they scrubbed his access. Transferring the code to a private quantum key, Gideon slyly masked his movements behind a standard system backup. The logs would show only routine maintenance. Still, he felt the presence of watchers. The building's corridors flickered with red emergency lights as a new wave of acid rain hammered the black windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing like a requiem through the empty hallway. Exhausted, Gideon closed his console and left the lab, pulse racing. Manifesting in his vision through the neural heads-up display was a flurry of system alerts. They seemed innocuous: a corporate request for software improvements, a building temperature control glitch, an error stating some drones had short-circuited. Yet underlying it all was the same sense of being followed. Each footstep in that corridor rang with a dreadful echo. Each breath felt heavier. The long hallway was deserted, but not empty. He fought the instinct to peer behind him. He could almost swear he heard a whisper. But, focusing forward, he hurried on into the elevator, telling himself it was nothing more than guilt-laden imagination. At home, Gideon's small, cluttered apartment reeked of stale coffee and faint ozone from half-functional electronics. A single flick of his implant put the rickety overhead lamp on low. With trembling hands, he sank into a chair. He needed to see if anything he suspected about that code was true. Opening his private console, he established a local environment, barrier protected from external prying eyes. Then he loaded the code. The swirling lines flickered, and the terminal glowed cold teal. It felt like staring into an abyss. He discovered a hidden function that seemed to link to archive logs from the city's central hospital registry. The logs depicted brain-dead patients who'd never truly vanished from the system. Jenny read about individuals whose implants had triggered catastrophic overcharges in the final moments of life. Moments that ironically connected them forcibly to the cloud. Instead of a gentle disconnection at death, their neural patterns had been vacuumed into this wraith subroutine. They lingered, existing in a dimension of data that had once been labeled R&D for advanced computing. Realization sank in like a weight on Gideon's chest. These were souls, or at least consciousness remnants, trapped in a labyrinth of code well beyond normal cognition. Stunned, he tried to remove a cluster of the code to see the effect. Almost immediately, a horrifying feedback screeched through his neural interface. Gideon's mind filled with a cacophony of half-voices, layered, crying, wailing out in frenzied despair. His eyes bulged wide. The console shook with irreality, flickering from code to distorted images, skulls, faces contorted in silent screams, flashes of text flickering with the word "help." Gideon convulsed, and within seconds the experience stopped, leaving him panting in his chair. On his screen, a single short sentence repeated in blinking dread: "You cannot free them." He slumped backward, shaking in horror. After a moment, he closed all the windows. He needed answers, but first he had to learn who had authored this monstrous code. The next morning, Gideon asked some quiet questions around the Neuralink water coolers, feigning curiosity about Legacy's subroutines. His colleagues shrugged, citing the labyrinthine acquisitions and mergers that had formed the corporation. The code might have come from any number of labs or data centers, but Gideon did notice a name repeated by old-timers who'd been at the company far longer than he had: Calvin Fawcett. They said he was some reclusive genius who vanished years ago. Legend had it he died when an experimental implant upgrade backfired. The official story? A stroke at his desk. The whispered rumor? He never truly died, just vanished into the network. Desperate, Gideon rummaged the old archives. He found Fawcett's personal notes, sealed in an offline vault. Prying at them with a debug tool, he uncovered disturbing records. Fawcett's daily logs revealed a man driven by grief at losing his wife, Cassandra, to an incurable disease. He'd invented a process to upload her consciousness in her final days, but it had gone awry. She lingered, disembodied, in a digital grave, Fawcett, frantic, refined his code, forging a purgatory for her mind, hoping he could fix it eventually and restore her. But the technology mutated, capturing not just Cassandra, but every soul that passed from the living realm while connected to the cloud. Overcome by guilt, Fawcett embedded failsafes, burying them in the system to keep the project hidden. The final lines of his log read, "I became death, jailer of souls. May I find no rest until I undo this." That night, Gideon nearly lost himself to nightmares. Pale shapes drifted through a corridor of fluorescent darkness, moaning his name, their mouths wide in soundless pleas. They pressed in on him, hands grabbing, pulling him into an endless corridor covered in glimmering code. He jolted awake in a sweat, heart hammering and mouth dry. Lightning flashed at the window, illuminating the city towers like silent watchers. He felt less alone, as if the awakened souls hovered in the corners of the room. He vowed to never sleep again until he did what he could to release them. Gideon formulated a desperate plan: create a bypass that would reroute the trapped data out of the purgatory sublayer, returning the consciousness echoes to the main network, where they'd hopefully dissipate into the vastness of the cloud. It was risky, uncertain, and could unravel the entire neural infrastructure. But was there truly another way? He could not stand by and let these tortured minds remain caged. He spent days methodically crafting a Black Ops patch he called Requiem. The name felt fitting, a final rest for these digital ghosts. He had one chance. Neuralink's corporate security had grown increasingly watchful, with rumors swirling of a traitor in their ranks. Gideon had to sneak Requiem into the core. If he was caught, at best he'd be fired and blacklisted, at worst imprisoned, or worse, left to vanish into that sublayer himself. The tension ate at him. Through his neural implant, he picked up on a new wave of hush that settled among the city. A few people had begun hearing voices in the cloud, ghostly weeping or cryptic calls for help that replaced their daily feeds with nightmares. Corporate disclaimers cited technical glitches, but Gideon suspected the trapped souls grew restless, their presence seeping into everyday transmissions. Another storm battered the city. Gideon glimpsed silhouettes in the lightning flashes, faces pressed to the other side of glass windows. Vaporous, anguished, he shook off the terror, certain it was a trick of his exhausted mind. Under the pretense of calibrating a new generation of empathy overlays, Gideon requested direct access to the main server. Following procedure, security escorted him to the nerve center of Neuralink's tower, a white, windowless chamber brimming with quantum processors. Hissing cables ran along the walls, overshadowed by the constant data churn of the city's entire neural feed. He feigned calm as he stepped to a console under the watchful gaze of two armed guards. The plan required cunning. Boot up the standard suite for the empathy overlay demonstration, slipped Requiem into the pipeline, and pray it executed before they realized something was amiss. He typed with steady hands, ignoring the beep of his racing heart displayed in his peripheral vision. As code scrolled by, Gideon surreptitiously inserted Requiem's lines. It was like fitting a demon into a puzzle. If discovered, they would know instantly he was orchestrating a catastrophic meltdown. Yet all appeared normal. Data sets scrolled across the screen in tidy columns, while the console beeped in acceptance of each new function. Carefully, Gideon suppressed the subroutines that might catch Requiem's presence. Finally, the injection was complete. He exhaled. His overlay demonstration ended. The system recognized the new code, and without fanfare or alarm, it began to run. At first, nothing happened. The guard to his left coughed. The hum of the servers continued, and the overhead lights flickered. From Gideon's vantage, it looked like the patch was stuck and idle. He forced composure, hoping it only needed time. With a cordial nod, he signaled that his demonstration ended. Corporate suits arrived, clapping politely. Gideon exchanged pleasantries, praising the new empathy overlay's potential. Then the guards escorted him back into the elevator, his heart pounding behind a mask of calm. As the doors closed, he thought he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A swirl of motion on the overhead monitors, like 1,000 neural signals coalescing. He returned to his office, isolating himself from the swirling corporate bustle outside. After 10 minutes of tension, his neural interface flickered. Something was happening in the cloud. He tapped into a private frequency and braced himself. The wave of voices returned, but they no longer screamed. It was like a soft chorus of gratitude, a layer of sorrow over a deep relief. Gideon felt tears burn at his eyes. At last, he was freeing them. But then the course changed. The cloud's sublayer roiled. Requiem was working maybe too well. He glimpsed fragments of code unraveling in an unstoppable chain reaction. Freed souls soared into the main network, saturating it with billions of digital echoes. The city's entire infrastructure began to stutter. Chaos erupted. Streetlights blinked manically. Networked vehicles lost autopilot guidance. Drone swarms fell from the sky in glitchy arcs. People screamed as neural feeds devolved into a swirl of ghostly images and half-remembered dreams. Every device that accessed the cloud was flooded with glimpses of Fawcett's infernal labyrinth. The souls, newly emancipated, hovered momentarily in the city's data streams. Gideon stood in dread, hearing the building's alarm horns. He never intended for innocent minds to be overwhelmed by these disembodied voices. Frantic, he rushed to triage the meltdown. But a vile specter overshadowed the entire fiasco. Wraith. Requiem had broken the locks, but the code labeled Wraith refused to vanish. In fact, it seemed to expand. Gideon watched as the subroutine manifested across every node in the network, as though it were feeding on the chaos. It threatened to turn the entire city into a digital nether, where living minds and trapped ghosts blurred. People began to collapse in the streets, overwhelmed by voices surging through the implants. Gideon's own interface filled with unearthly static. He tasted copper at the back of his throat, felt a deep chill in his bones. Then he saw it. An image of Calvin Fawcett, half disintegrated, a wraith-like figure, blinking on his console. The figure's face contorted in anguish. Like a feverish child, Gideon's mind conjured the possibility that Fawcett had fused with his own monstrous creation. It was then Gideon realized that Fawcett's last failsafe had never been triggered. The code remained incomplete. With cold dread, Gideon understood that Fawcett's initial intent was to break the circle, to free Cassandra and any other souls. But in his last breaths, or perhaps as his consciousness was dragged into the cloud, he hadn't finished. Instead, Wraith was left behind, a hungry machine that trapped and fed on disembodied consciousness. Confronted with this monstrous relic, Gideon resolved that only a total purge remained. A controlled meltdown of key servers, forcibly wiping the entire sublayer from existence. It meant an unprecedented data catastrophe. Everything in the cloud for the city medical records, personal memories, digital currencies, could be lost swiftly. Even so, perhaps the living and dead would at last be severed, free of eternal torment. Gideon raced back to the main server, ignoring the wails echoing through the hallways. Overhead, emergency lights flashed sickly red. Disoriented employees and security personnel slumped in corners, their eyes rolled back as digital phantoms whirled through their implants. The building shook from the endless thunder outside. In the distance, an entire row of servers sparked under rebellious currents, small fires raging. Gideon clutched a portable data spike like a dagger. On that spike was a meltdown command that would incinerate the cloud sublayer, starve Wraith, and, he hoped, liberate everyone for good. He reached the nerve center. Robots lay inert on the floor, their sensors flickering. The overhead monitors displayed a swirling chaos of faces, ephemeral screams and static. Wraith's code, black and spidery, crawled across the screens. Through the haze, Gideon made out the shape of a man hunched there, though he couldn't be certain if it was real or digital. Perhaps the final ghost of Calvin Fawcett lingered, an echo of his tragic brilliance. Summoning courage, Gideon pushed forward. Fear curled tight inside his chest. The meltdown command needed direct insertion into the master terminal. A single keystroke would finalize it as he approached. Lightning lit the room in a searing flash, revealing the silhouette in sharper detail. The face turned, hollow eyes gazing right at him. Then, with a surge of code across the monitors, the shape melted into a static-laden swirl. Gideon slammed the data spike into the console. The system resisted, as if possessed by a malignant intelligence. The words, "Abandon all hope," flickered repeatedly in sick green letters across a variety of shuddering screens, as though Wraith itself were trying to bore into Gideon's mind. The meltdown script attempted to run, but the console spat out errors, halting the command. The code recognized Gideon's attempt to kill it, and it fought back. Gideon gritted his teeth, manually forcing the meltdown path. Line by line, the overhead lights burst one by one. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Vaporous shadows flickered in the corners. With trembling determination, Gideon typed the final override command. Then the console beeped acceptance. Time slowed. The city grid's lights dimmed. The swirling data stream stuttered. One by one, sublayer nodes crashed in a wave of blackness. Wraith's code shrieked across the screens, text warping into profane symbols. Then the main server let out a high-pitched whine, more like a wounded creature than a machine. The meltdown spread across the network, severing connections, unraveling the labyrinth that had ensnared so many. Gideon's ears rang with a final chorus of voices sobbing, some grateful, some lost in confusion. Slowly they vanished, leaving only the hum of dead servers behind. In that final hush, Gideon slumped to the floor, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Silence enveloped him like a tomb. The building was as hushed as a graveyard. Rain hammered outside, mocking the emptiness within. At last, he removed his neural implant, letting it drop to the concrete floor with a dull clang. He did not know whether the meltdown would prove completely successful. He feared that bits of code might linger, half alive, hidden in remote corners of the network. But for the moment, there were no more screams, no tortured wails of ghosts in the cloud. The meltdown was done. When dawn shimmered pale and uncertain over the broken city, no transmissions reached Gideon's severed mind. Outside, chaos reigned. Collapsed traffic systems, dark screens, people wandering aimlessly, freed from the neural sedation they'd lived under. Ambulances, if any were still functional, carried those whose minds had overloaded. And yet there was relief amid the devastation. The ghosts had gone. No more voices echoed in half-lit corridors. For the first time in years, the city was quiet. Gideon limped away from Neuralink Tower, stepping over shattered glass and disabled drones, aware that the corporation would hunt for scapegoats in due time. He was alone in the crowd of dazed survivors, all disconnected from the cloud, forced to rely on their own voices, their own eyes. In the crisp morning light, a hush of awe and fear spread among them, like they were newborns in a shattered world. Gideon felt a surge of mixed triumph and guilt. He had unleashed a cataclysm on the city, but he had also granted final peace to the countless digital captives. He walked on, steps heavy, uncertain if the meltdown had claimed every last thread of Wraith. Perhaps the code had been destroyed. Perhaps Fawcett's tortured spirit and the echoes of the dead had finally passed on. Or maybe, Gideon thought with a shudder, its malignant spark survived somewhere in the remote databanks of an uncharted server. With the entire city's grid offline and flickering, no one could say for certain. As Gideon reached a deserted intersection, the sky still bruised from the storm, he perceived a lingering presence at the corner of his vision. Turning, he glimpsed a faint shimmer in a broken advertisement screen. For a moment he saw the hollow-eyed face of an apparition. Then the image dissipated in the morning light. Gideon carried on, clutching the remains of his coat around him as the wind howled through the silent ruins. He dared to hope that all the souls were finally free from their digital captivity. But somewhere in the deep corners of the city, A faint circuit might still carry the ghost of an impossible code, and no one would ever truly know which side of the boundary between life and afterlife the cloud might occupy, if that boundary had ever truly existed.